Good afternoon. So I'm Enrique Fernandez Macias. I'm a researcher in Eurofound. And first of all, well, on behalf of myself and my colleagues, Eleonora and Danielle, I have to say that we are very glad to be here and be able to discuss some of our work with a bunch of people, which is quite different from our normal audience, which would be more like EU-level policymakers, social partners, and researchers. The full and very long name of our employer of Eurofound is the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, which sounds a little bit like the name of some kind of organization in an old spy movie or something like that, but it actually stands for a European research agency that for the last 4 decades has been studying the living and working conditions of Europeans with a mandate to provide support to the formulation of better policies in those areas. So that's basically what we do. Now, the program of Eurofound is structured in activities, which are broad areas of research in which we carry out different projects over a 4-year cycle. And in the current 4-year cycle, in the current program of work, which starts this year and ends in 2020, we have included a new activity under the title, The Digital Age Implications for Work and Employment. And this is what we are going to speak about today. So what myself and my colleagues are going to present is some of the preparatory work that we are doing right now, because we're just starting on this new activity within Eurofound. And therefore, in a way, it's kind of important to emphasize that here you can expect perhaps interesting questions and suggestive ideas, but not definite answers, because we haven't got that far yet in many ways. And from our side, what we are particularly interested in is in hearing your opinions about those initial ideas that we have, because we are still at the moment in which we can improve things from our own approach on this matter. So I will first present some of our initial ideas and initial assumptions on this program of work. Then Eleonora will present the main findings of a literature review on this subject that we have carried over the last few months. And then finally, Daniel will discuss some of the initial ideas in terms of implications for social policy. Okay, so the first question we must answer is why study the social implications, the work and employment implications of digital technologies now, decades after the digital revolution in many ways. So, you know, the microprocessor, as you all know, is invented in the 70s. Computers became household appliances in the 80s. The internet was already having a significant impact in terms of culture and commerce in the late 90s. So it seems like old news in some ways. Now, if you look at economic history, economic historians have argued, people such as Carlota Perez and people like that, have argued that significant, radical technological revolutions have taken quite a significant amount of time to actually transform fundamentally the nature and structure of economic processes. It takes some time for that. And the reason is that because they involve, when they are really radical, they have to fight in some ways against the existing work practices, cultural values, even institutional frameworks, which display some inertia, and in some cases even some active resistance, okay? And there are lots of examples of this. A well-known example that has been discussed recently is, for instance, the introduction of electricity in factories in early 20th century, which took a bit of time. You know, for some time, factories remained, even after the introduction of electricity, factories remained organized around a central big engine, which is the kind of organization that was necessary when steam was the main technology for providing power for the machinery of factories. Despite the fact that with electricity, it's much easier to organize the productive process in smaller batches using different smaller electric engines. And this is something that it took some time for engineers to actually notice and start reorganizing factories. So it took some time for that to actually kick in. And sometimes, as I was saying, it can be actual resistance, active resistance. And the reason is that, again, new technologies can challenge powerful vested interests, which are engaged sometimes in previous technologies in a way. And in that sense, a good example could be the reaction that big car manufacturers are having to the challenge of the new electric vehicle technology, for instance, nowadays. So this is this kind of processes that explains this time lag. Now, eventually those resistances are overcome, but it takes some time. And this is actually what may explain some of the paradoxes of the new economy and of the effect of new digital technologies. For instance, if you know in this area that there is a bit of a debate in terms that it seems that the effect of digital technologies in terms of productivity is still not really found in some ways. And some people argue, some people take that as proof that they are after all not such a big deal. In economic terms. Now, it may be, and again, if you go back to history, what history may tell you is that it may just be that it still hasn't kicked in, really, and we may see that effect more in the years to come when these technologies mature, and not only the technologies, but the actual application, which is a different thing. So that would be the initial reason to study this now. But there is an even more important reason, which is a related one, on why study now the implications of the digital age on work and employment. And again, the history of technological revolutions shows that they have generally been associated with very significant transformations of the institutional structure. And the reason is basically the same as I was saying before. Precisely because, and to the extent that they involve a significant, a fundamental transformation of economic processes, they tend to render the existing institutional framework of the economy obsolete to some extent, okay? And very often, in fact, without institutional redesign, technological revolutions can actually lead with time to significant social and economic dislocation and even political conflict and political unrest. In some ways, the Industrial Revolution itself, the original Industrial Revolution in 18th century England, can be taken as an example of that. It's a big technological revolution that, as we all know, it led to very significant social dislocation. It led to the well-known awful working and living conditions in industrial towns, etc., etc. And it led as well, it was associated with a very significant institutional transformation, in many ways, the origins of capitalism itself. So, so that's a very important point, and perhaps in that sense, an even more useful example is the economic and political crisis that followed the last big technological revolution, according to most authors on this matter, which would be the one associated with Ford's mass production, the automobile, big oil, etc., in the early 20th century. And again, many people argue that that contributed very significantly to the increasing level of social inequality, social problems, financial troubles, etc., that led to the very terrible 1930s, as you all know. And again, many people argue that it was only when capitalism reformed itself along the lines of Keynesianism and welfare redistribution, etc., that it actually became sustainable, and that the full benefits of that technological revolution could actually spread throughout the population. So in a way, the point there is that a key starting point of our whole research program on the digital age is that we are now at a similar turning point. In that sense, because it is now when when digital technologies are really starting to kick in, maturing, and really starting to transform significantly the economic processes, it is now that they are in fact challenging also socioeconomic and institutional structures. And even some of the social problems, I mean, things like, as you know, the growth of inequality in recent years in many developed economies, even the political problems or political unrest in recent years that we see in many countries, many people relate as well to those undercurrents of technological change in underlying economic processes. So in that sense, it's particularly important now at this point to try to understand as good as possible what is going on and what are the implications, in this case for work and employment and other social issues, of these changes in order to be able to regulate them better. And this is the whole point, in many ways, of our work in this activity, okay, over the next 4-year period. Now, the key question here of this activity is how is the digital revolution affecting work and employment? And in order to answer this, what we propose in our approach is to differentiate 3 broad categories of combined applications of digital technologies, 3 kind of clusters of technologies which have different, they are related of course, but they have different types of implications in terms of work and employment. And these we call 3 vectors of change, and this is what will structure our work on this. These vectors of change rely on infrastructures, technologies, and skills that are already widely available after 4 decades almost of digital revolution now. So in that sense, they correspond, as I was saying before, to this kind of second mature stage of the digital revolution. So let's discuss this in turn. The first one is automation. The first of these vectors of change is automation. How do we define automation? Automation we define as the replacement of labor input by machine input for some types of tasks within production. That's the very general definition. Now, such a very general definition, you could say, and it's definitely the case, that it's not such a new thing. I mean, there is automation, there has been automation for some time. There have been replacement of labor input by machine input for some types of tasks. So what is new about automation in the digital age? Well, basically, the thing is that by the application of digital technologies, using algorithmic control of machinery and with digital sensors and with ever-increasing computing power, what happens is that you're expanding enormously the range and the type of tasks that you can automate. So that is what is new. And in this sense, in order to discuss this, and this is the way we approach this, it is useful to differentiate types of tasks within production. And therefore, if you differentiate types of tasks, what you can say is that even before the digital revolution, the types of tasks that were already automated to a large extent are routine tasks of a physical nature. And this would be the kind of task that you associate to traditional industrial work. It's Charles Chaplin in modern times doing repetitive physical work, manual work. Now, those types of tasks have to a large extent been automated already in many ways, in many developed economies. So that's definitely not new. Then the digital revolution, from the very beginning, from the very appearance of microprocessors, et cetera, they start facilitating the automation of the other big category of routine tasks, which are routine intellectual tasks, repetitive intellectual tasks, which we would, things like paperwork, repetitive administrative work, et cetera, et cetera. Now, since the 70s, that has been automated to a large extent because that's what digital technologies do very well, to do repetitive information processing types of activities. So that is also something that to some extent has been automated already, even though that continues. So what is new is that in this kind of mature period of digital revolution, with things such as artificial intelligence, pattern recognition, et cetera, what happens is that for the first time, we can automate, or the types of tasks that can be automated include also non-routine tasks. Non-routine tasks of both physical and intellectual nature. So we have examples such as, I don't know, driving, for instance, the type of tasks associated with driving. And then in terms of intellectual tasks, I don't know, translation, even lawyer services, et cetera, can be automated with these new kinds of technologies. And then you can argue, so what is left then? What kind of category of tasks remain? And what remains is the very broad category of social tasks. And if you think about it, the idea there is social tasks are by definition, the object of social tasks is social interaction itself. So in that sense, you could argue that it's by definition away from automation, at least until robots exist, or machines that are kind of indistinguishable to humans. And that is something that seems still far from today, but this is where things may be going, or that may be the final frontier of automation. So anyway, that's the first strand of research of Eurofound in this respect, which we will look at this. We will specifically look at the automation of services in Europe. This is the first project that we're starting to work. And we will look at the specifically about the possibilities of automation, of further automation of non-routine and social tasks. The second vector of change in our approach is digitization. Here we don't refer to the general process of increasing use of digital technologies in society, but to the very specific process of use of digital sensors and rendering devices to translate part of the physical production process into a digital realm. and vice versa. Okay, so we're talking about things such as 3D printing, the Internet of Things, virtual, augmented reality, etc., which kind of blur the boundaries within production between the physical and the digital realms. Now, what's the point about that? The point about that is that because the processing, storage, and communication of digital information is orders of magnitude more efficient than the equivalent for analog information, by digitizing the productive process, we increase enormously our capacity to understand, control, and manipulate it. So that's the key point of this. Now, the main potential concern of this, the main issue here in terms of implications of work and employment is probably issues of privacy and control. And when we speak about this kind of cyber-physical systems in which every item, every object in the workplace is essentially a surveillance device because it's collecting information on its environment, and you have know-all algorithms that can control the entire work process and therefore can control every single action by individual workers, by human workers, that can lead to significant problems in terms of privacy and control and autonomy for workers. So this is the second strand in which we will look precisely at that. What does it mean for workers, that kind of digitization? And then the third and final vector of change in our approach is platforms. Platforms, we define it again at a high level of generality as digital networks that coordinate economic transactions in an algorithmic way. Here, our take is that platforms, the specific thing about platforms is that they perform functions which are, and here we speak about platforms such as Uber, Airbnb, I mean, all types of platforms. They perform functions that traditionally were performed by markets or firms separately, and they perform them together. So in that sense, on the one hand, they provide a space and a coordinating mechanism for transactions between buyers and suppliers of goods or services, and in that sense, they are like a market. But at the same time, all platforms involve to a larger or smaller level, but they all involve that. They all involve also a set of algorithms that directly monitor and control, manage that transaction. And in that sense, those platforms are performing, those algorithms are performing the equivalent to the functions that in a firm would be performed by a manager. So in that sense, they are firms as well. They are kind of hierarchical structures simultaneously. So they are both markets and firms. And in fact, you could argue that they transcend both, which as can be seen by the fact that their coordinating efficiency allows the creation of new markets and the marketization of things that were not in markets before. And so this is the key point about platforms, but it's also one of the reasons why they are potentially very disruptive in terms of social and economic implications. Perhaps one of the most disruptive in the short run of these three categories. And the reason is that that the existing regulation of work and employment assumes a distinction between markets and firms, a clear demarcation in that respect, that doesn't really quite apply to platforms. And that means that platforms remain in a kind of strange, gray area, in a kind of limbo in that respect, which means that in practice, in many cases, there is the danger that workers, consumers, and even competitors of these platforms don't have the same level of protection, the same level of regulation of in the traditional economy. So this is the third strand of research that we will look at, and we will try to look at that, look at the diversity of platforms, and look at what kind of implications they may have, again, with a look to improve regulation in that sense. So that's about it. Now, Eleonora will talk about, okay.
So first of all, after each of the speakers, we're going to take a quick 5 minutes for questions, if anybody has questions. If anyone does have a question for Enrique, now is the time to put up your hand and I'll repeat it. If not, we'll move on. But at the end, the team is going to be outside at the breakout area for an Ask Me Anything, for a more informal Ask Me Anything with the team. We're going to move then on to Eleonora Peruffo. I hope I didn't do that too badly. For a literature review of what the experts are saying.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today, and also thank you to Republica for having us. So as my colleague Enrique said, he focused on he described the drivers of technological change that we examined, and I'm going to focus on especially the impact that they are going to have on employment and social dialogue. Just a quick side note, this literature review is based on the consultation of academic papers, of course, specialized industry magazines, and newspaper articles, given that the topic is very much contemporary. If you look at the newspapers, everybody's talking about it now. And then, since this is a literature review, I just wanted to make it clear that this is not the official position of Eurofound. It's a description of what has been found in the field. Okay, let's begin. So, both for workers and governments alike, one of the worries is to understand how many jobs and by when are going to be destroyed by automation. Okay, so it's not something that people are only talking about. There are academics who are looking at this, studying this, and one of the most important studies was in the most important studies was in 2013 by Osborne and Frey, and with this study, they examined 702 occupations across the US and found out that 47% of the jobs were likely to be automated in the next 10 to 20 years. Okay, so if we have just a quick look at the screen, you can see that on the far left, the light blue is management, business, and financial, the financial jobs, which require a high level of skills and a high level of social interaction. And as already anticipated by Enrique, these were the jobs that were found as less likely to be automated. While if you look at the far right on the top, you see the brown color which characterizes transportation and logistics, which are actually the jobs which were believed to be most likely at risk of automation. So one of the findings of this study was essentially that there was going to be an upgrading of the labor market, in the sense that the jobs where high level education and high level of creativity and social intelligence and social interactions were going to be the ones which were going to be safe. Several other studies, both in the US and the EU, followed this methodology and found, again, a risk of automation of jobs between 30% and 40%. But not everybody was agreed with this approach, and they moved some critics to these estimates. So well, I'm going to illustrate that with an example. Does anybody know what's the only job that disappeared due to automation? No? Okay, let's try with one. Telephonist? No, it actually changed because there was a change in technology. The technology became old. Some people say ATMs, but actually it wasn't, because the bank tellers actually increased after the introduction of ATM, because the banks were able to move bank tellers from just the action of depositing and withdrawing money to other functions. So the only job which in the literature is said to have disappeared is the elevator boy. So this guy, I had to look into that because it wasn't clear to me why. So the tasks of the elevator boy were many. He had to open the doors, close the doors, being able to move the cogs and mechanisms in order to decide what floor and to make the elevator move. Now, everything is made with the push of the button. And if you think about it, some elevators also now speaks and they play music. So what's the point that I'm trying to make here? And that's also the point that some academics made to the study that we just saw. A job is not made, is not a whole, is made of different tasks. So each task can be automated on its own, and the tasks in a job don't necessarily have to be automated all at the same time, because it also depends on the technology and the approach that that particular job has to a certain function that needs to perform. Okay, given this, are the robots going to take over? No, not yet. At least there are some studies which took the approach of studying more how many tasks are routine within a job and how many of these can be automated. So last year, the OECD, a body which gathers countries from, does research across several countries, including US, Europe, and so on, estimated that actually the risk of automation, according to the approach of how many tasks can be automated, was around 9%. With a range of 6% for Korea, up to 12% for Austria. Ireland, just as a matter of curiosity, because it is morning, I thought, oh, I'm speaking in Ireland, let's see. 9%, around 8 to 9% of jobs are at risk of automation, according to this approach. Not all the jobs are going to disappear, and not so soon. There are so many jobs that are going to stay, but these drivers of change are going to introduce also some new type of jobs. And these new type of jobs can be both at the top end of the scale or the bottom end of the pay scale. When I say scale, I'm talking about the pay. So some of them, I don't know, maybe some of you are in the field of data analysis or web programming, digital marketing. Just out of curiosity, how many of you in this field? Okay, a few. But these technological drivers, especially for the platforms, are going to introduce some type of jobs which are going to be with the low salary and very, and let's say not so advantageous contractual conditions. For example, people who work in Uber, or for example, people who work in image tagging. They just do image tagging all day, and that's a very lowly remunerated job. Okay, now I would like to speak quickly about the second driver of change, which includes the technologies of 3D printing, Internet of Things, and virtual and augmented reality. Now, it might sound weird that they are all together, but they actually have things in common. They all allow work to be performed online in a virtual space, and in that sense, the goods becomes the data. This enables people to work, then they can work remotely, which has its advantages, but at the same time, it could have a very profound impact on the way the labor market is structured, because it will just push away the geographical barrier. Imagine if a factory becomes a virtual twin of the real factory because the sensors are sending all the data and so on. The data analyst can be based in China and control a factory which is based in Sweden. Just think about that. It's one of the ideas that academics are exploring. Another thing about location, working remotely, and so on, is that anyway, the type of skills that are going to be required out of the people who work with these technologies will be very high skills, because you have to have data analysts, managers, engineers, even the workers who work with the machines and the robots in the factory. They all have to have a very high level of knowledge and be able to communicate effectively with each other in a multidisciplinary way. Just as a note, I didn't find the health and safety risks in particular for these technologies, but one worth mentioning is 3D printing. Since 3D printing is being implemented now at industrial scale, there could be some type of risks due to the fact that they are using new powders and new materials for which there are not enough studies which tell us how risky they are. Okay, let's start. Let's go to the third driver of change, which is platforms. Platforms, as Enrique said, they are they are the other big topic being discussed in the field of technological change. And for this, in particular, I want just to distinguish between crowd work and gig work for people who are not familiar with it. So crowd work is platform work, which is advertised online and performed online, such as Amazon Mechanical Turk, for example. While gig work is a job which is advertised online and performed locally. So there are some advantages in this type of work. It's on demand, so the worker can decide when to work, but at the same time, if they are, the negative side is that if they decide to, if they need to work, they have to accept any type of task that is assigned by the platform, and it might also entail that they have to work at unsociable hour and for a very low fee. And here, similar to the second driver of change, we see that there is again a demolition of the location and the geographical barrier, because people who work, especially for crowd work, people who bid to do a job online, they might be based in Argentina, they might be based in Spain, they might be based in China, and they would be competing in a labor market which is at global level. Then, just briefly, I will. There is a lot to say about social dialogue and the role that social dialogue could have, but I would like to point out that first of all, these three drivers of change have in common that again the competition is moving is shifting from local to global, and that it. Especially for trade unions, it would be very difficult to be able to organize a workforce which is very fragmented and which is also which might not be bound just to an employer, but just performing tasks for different employers all the time. So they might not be that interested in changing things with one employer if they know that they can find a source of income somewhere else. And then I would like to conclude with something with a point that came up in a lot of the studies that we consulted, which is the theme of skills, in the sense that now the traditional path of skills, the traditional path, sorry, of upskilling, which entailed that somebody started at entry level and then stayed in the job a few years, learned a few things, was able then to get to expert level. No, with these digital technologies and drivers of technological change now, if you need a lot of knowledge in order to make the jump from entry level to expert level. Meaning that some workers might be displaced by the introduction of these technologies in the world of work in their sector. Doesn't matter if it's manufacturing or services. And there are both, I think, employer, governments, and trade unions need to find a way to need to find solutions in order to coordinate this action, in order to build a society in which humans can, live together. So this has also a lot of implications from the point of view of social policies. What can governments do, and what solutions can be put in place in order to support these workers who are displaced. This is something that Daniel is going to explain now. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleonora. Have we any questions from the floor? Okay, gentleman here.
Quick question. Did the literature make any distinction between jobs and processes within firms? The reason I'm asking is what I see is that firms are very much interested in replacing processes altogether with technology. Not so much, okay, I have a lawyer and I find different, I don't know, I take parts of his or whatever he's doing. It's more like I look at the compliance team within a firm, for instance, within financial services, and I digitize complete processes so that I will lose departments altogether. Or basically I try to replace departments. Did the I don't know, literature went into that and looked into that?
I don't think that in the literature is discussed necessarily that way. I mean, in a way that that process makes automation be closer to the traditional thing, to traditional things such as subcontracting and things like that, because it's essentially, you know, it kind of functions almost within firms. The approach now in the literature, they tend to speak about tasks, because you really want to see, you know, when you speak about automation, normally you speak about actual beats of the work process. And normally, you know, when you speak about a certain machine, I mean, you cannot set up a machine that replaces an entire function. That's really difficult. I mean, in a way, it's even more difficult than the idea of replacing an entire job, you know, to replace an entire function. Now, I think that in practice, it may be that firms, what they do in practice is, again, is they just would subcontract, and there would be some companies that would offer a kind of automation, or just simply that would do some functions. Probably they would automate some of those tasks. I doubt that you would automate the entire function, and it's for the same kind of reasons that Eleonora was saying before, which is it's really impossible so far that you set up a machine that can do anything within a single area, in the same way that it's kind of impossible to set up a machine that would do everything for a single type of occupation. You know, it's really at the level of tasks. It's in order to do something that you can set up a machine to do it. But kind of general purpose machines that can do anything in an area or in a job, it's really difficult. Yeah.
Just to give you an example, one of the things we will probably see within the next 3 to 5 years is if you think about content creation within financial services, there's a huge burden on compliance. And the technology is going into a direction whereby content creation in itself will be probably be automated to a larger extent. So what I can see by 2020 is that you can easily implement FCA regulation for the UK, within the UK framework. You can easily implement FCA regulation into an AI which creates content, and this will be updated by an API. So the whole process of creation, as well as looking whether something is compliant, will be more or less, you make sure that this is compliant by putting it into the engine which creates the content. And this, to me, is a complete substitution. Yeah. Which is done at the moment by either subcontractors or by departments within those organizations. Just to give you an example.
I'm going to ask you to take that to ask me anything afterwards. If there was no more questions today here.
So you mentioned percentages of automated jobs in different countries. Yep. I was wondering if you know anything about the rate of automation.
Sorry, here's a microphone.
You can just introduce yourself as well.
Hi. I'm Andrea. Is this working? Yes. So I asked, you mentioned some of the percentage of automated jobs, also in Ireland, and I was wondering if you know anything about the rate of the automation, like how fast does it go?
For the entire economy, it's difficult to estimate. You can look into studies for each of the economic sectors and in each of the industries in order to find out what the rate of automation is. If you are interested in the rate at which robots are growing, there is the International Federation of Robotics, which releases statistics every year about the level of the number of robots which are being acquired. And as at a very high level, I can say that in Asia, the number of robots is a lot higher than in Europe.
Okay.
I don't want to go into the more specific because you need really to speak about the sector and.
Fernandez?
Yeah, just to say a kind of a small comment in this respect is that really in practice, I mean, if you look at all these predictions that Eleonora was saying, especially the initial ones that were kind of, you could see them everywhere, they were in all newspapers and everything, and they were talking about in 10 to 20 years, the automation of nearly 50% of employment in the US or the UK or something. Now, if you think about rates, I think that was published in 2012 or something like that, and the span was a period of kind of 15 years or something. Now, kind of a third of that period of time has passed already. So there should have been a third of that automated already, unless it's all automated in the last couple of years of that period. What I mean is that in practice, all those predictions continuously, systematically show themselves to be overdone. You know, you never actually see that, except for some very particular cases. You may find automation of some jobs, but in general, this idea that, you know, like 50% of jobs disappear, it just never happens. So far, maybe it will happen in the future.
Okay, we're going to move on. The final speaker is Daniel Molinuevo. Glad I got that one right. And he's going to speak on the implications for digitalisation for social policy.
To the impact of digitalization, you know, for the welfare state, the tone in general is of concern, particularly when it comes to the impact of platforms. As we all know, platforms do not pay social security contributions because most of their platform workers, they are classified as self-employed. That means as well that it gives them competitive advantages vis-a-vis other service providers who have employees and therefore make these contributions. So what we're going to see is an increase in the number of self-employed in the economy, and therefore there's going to be a higher reliance in tax-based pensions and social security services. In addition to that, if the concerns or the forecasts that there are in relation to the impact of automation on job losses turn to be true, which as my colleagues mentioned might not be the case, that will only aggravate the problem because we will have again, a number of job losses that has an impact on the social security contributions from labor, and also an increase in the demand for benefits in kind like unemployment benefits. So we have that all put in together will mean that our welfare states that are based on having most of the adult population working full time and making social security contributions will get in a crisis. So I'm going to describe briefly some of the mitigating measures and solutions that are put in place to offset this negative impact that automation has on. Can you hear me now with this? Yeah. Some of the measures that are put in place to mitigate this negative impact of platforms. So at the moment, we have that in Europe, there's not a lot of clarity to the extent to which European directives and regulations at the national level affect workers in platforms, in the sense of, you know, what benefits are they entitled to, what is the classification in relation to the type of worker that they are, and what sort of benefits they should contribute to and are entitled to. But work of the International Labour Organization shows that most crowd workers are classified as self-employed. And even in those cases where platform workers are classified as employees, we have that because of the intermittent nature of their work, they do not have access to some benefits like maternity cover or healthcare benefits that are based on a minimum period of serving time. So what we have then is a situation where not only the working platforms, but also other practices such as contracting out and outsources are blurring these categories between independent employment and self-employment, which has an impact on, as I said, on social security contributions and the social protection coverage of workers. So what are the member states in the European Union doing to protect those workers that have some characteristics of employees and some characteristics of self-employed? Well, we're going to publish at the end of this month a report called Exploring Self-Employed in the European Union that describes the measures by member state. But we can see two trends. First of all, we have that some member states have created third categories that are in between dependent employment and self-employment. So some of them are brand new hybrid categories that are entitled to some benefits and mean that employers have to make some contributions. And there are other countries that have created subcategories of economically dependent workers. So for instance, in my home country, Spain, we have since 2007 the category of dependent autonomous workers, or what they have is that the unemployment insurance cover is mandatory for them, whereas it's voluntary for other self-employed workers. So that's one approach that several countries have, whereby other countries, what they have done is that they have opted for keeping this employee, self-employed binary categorization, and then what they have done is use economic dependence criteria to identify and combat bogus self-employment. Bogus self-employment being when people, in order to be hired, they are forced to be registered as a sole trader, but then they are treated as an employee, even though they are on paper they are self-employed. And also, what other countries have done is, yes, they maintain this classification, but they have more clearer criteria as to how to distinguish employment from self-employment. So, for instance, in Ireland, they have created guidelines and working definitions that allow to understand better what is employed and what is self-employed, even though they are not legally defined. So this is a set of guidelines that were produced by Ireland's Revenue Commissioner for tax purposes. In addition to the entitlement, we have an issue for platform workers of for the management and the administration of these benefits. So some of the proposals that have been put in place is one of risk pooling. So that will mean that people who work in platforms, they will be able to pool together and to buy together a set of benefits that will be more expensive if they were bought individually. So for instance, in the platform Lyft, what they have done is that they have reached an agreement in the US so that their platform workers can purchase healthcare benefits at a more advantageous rate from a private healthcare provider than if they were going to purchase them individually, every worker. There's a proposal in terms of the accrue of benefits and accumulation of the contributions from employers that comes from the US that has received a lot of attention, which is the portable safety net, which will be, instead of being linked to every employer, every employee will have one account to which all of the platforms and other employers will make pro rata contributions. And that account will be used to pay and fund and establish the entitlement for the different types of healthcare and social benefits. But that has been criticized by people in the International Labour Organization because of the legal confusion that will entail having all sorts of employers contributing the same way to these accounts. So that will mean, for instance, that we will have workers in platforms that have a relation that is similar to that of employees, but others, they have a relation that is similar to the one that a plumber coming to fix a pipe at home would mean. So it would be difficult to justify why the employers have to do a contribution in those cases, whereby these other self-employed workers do not have these contributions from their employers. And therefore, so what this author from the International Labour Organization advocates for is, rather than having this legally confusing account, is rather than informing compliance with labour standards, rather than having these portable security accounts. So that's when it comes to the situation of platform workers. But we have also other measures that deal more directly with the potential loss of jobs in relation to automation. And one of the most popular ones, or the one that has received more attention from the media, is the robot tax. And the robot tax is something that was supported this year, according to Quartz magazine, by Bill Gates, who said that this could be a way to slow down automation and the loss of jobs and fund some services like education or care for the elderly that need this funding. It has been the basis of a proposal done by the Legislative Affairs Committee in the European Parliament last year that introduced a set of measures, including the robot tax. And it has been considered in some jurisdictions. For instance, last month, it was announced in the media that they're thinking of introducing this measure of a robot tax in San Francisco. But at the moment, the only place where one can talk of something similar of a robot tax is in place is South Korea. And you might have seen during the summer some news reports saying that there is a robot tax in South Korea. The current state of South Korea robot tax is that what they're going to do is they're going to reduce a tax break for businesses that are investing in automation. So there's a tax deduction to 3 to 7% for businesses investing in automation that is due to expire this year. But what they have done is they have extended this tax break until 2019, but they have reduced the tax by 2%. So it's not really a robot tax, but something similar that they have put in place in South Korea. Even though there are some supporters, there has been a lot of widespread criticism to the robot tax. For instance, the European Parliament in February this year rejected this proposal from the Legislative Affairs Committee. The European Commission for the Digital Single Market also rejected any type of robot tax. And some of the critics, like for instance, Yanis Varoufakis, says that there are a number of practical implementation problems for any type of robot tax. So, for instance, it will be while the wages of human workers fluctuate, if you will need to establish a wage or the equivalent of a wage earned by a robot, it will have to be fixed, and that will lead, or it will have to be changed in an artificial way, which will lead to a lot of conflicts with the people that own the robots in the productive processes. And there's also the issue of the fact that there are robots operating machines that have never been operated by humans. So there's no clear equivalent between the human labor and robot labor in those places. If we're going to go for a robot tax that is like a lump sum when you purchase a robot that is not put in place for other type of machine, that's going to give an incentive to producers to bundle robots with these machines so that they don't need to be subject to this tax. And there's also issues of, the tax authorities will need to make some really difficult differentiations here of what is a robot that is taking a human's job, a person's job, and what is a robot that what is doing is enhancing the productivity of workers. So it would be, from a practical standpoint, there are a number of issues that make Varoufakis, but also other authors, advocate for something different, which is this idea of a universal basic income. I'm not going to dwell a lot on this because it's not directly related to the digitalization, but let's say that this idea of universal basic income, for which there are pilots at the moment in Finland and Scotland, has gained a new life with the discussion of automation and the loss of jobs. So there are a number of proposals in terms of whether it will be means tested, whether it will be given to the same amount to all the population, or whether it will be done on needs. But some of the critics, they say, is that it would be extremely costly. It's not clear that this universal basic income is going to be used to purchase health and social care benefits. And there's also the more general issue of, well, work is not only about earning a living, there's also issues of feeling productive and feeling fulfilled And so that there's these incentives with this universal basic income to participation in the labor market and in society in general. I'm going to finalize, because I'm aware of the time, making a quick reference to the fact that digitalization also has a huge impact on the delivery of social services. This is, for instance, the Irish website of care.com, and it's a platform where you can find somebody that can be a childminder, somebody that takes care of the old person. If you got a pet, they work your dog. And it's not a small platform. We got data that shows that it employs or has more than 6 million workers around the world. So that will be, from these estimates, the second largest platform in terms of workers. So because of the importance of digitalization on social services, we're going to start research looking at the implications of digitalization for the accessibility of social services. So looking at to what extent the digitalization of social services makes access to these services fairer, what is the impact in the design of delivery of services, and how we can bridge the digital divide, how we can make social service more inclusive. So I will be very interested if you have any examples of digital services, social services, or different ways in which social services are delivered in a digital way. By all means, get in touch or come to talk to us in the Ask Me Anything session that will have take place right after this.
Thank you, Daniel.